It's Friday, February 13th, 2009. This is Marna Weston for the Sam Proctor Oral History Program in the Graham Library at Pugh Hall with my colleague, our videographer, Deborah Hendricks. And this is an interview with Mr. Dan Harmeling of Bronson, Florida. Thank you for being here.
Gainesville, Florida.
From Gainesville, okay.
I taught in Bronson,
Okay.
but all the time I've lived in Gainesville, Florida.
A Gainesvillian, okay.
Yeah.
The chair stands corrected. Thank you very much for being
Okay,
here.
sure.
Appreciate it. The purpose of today's interview is a brief glimpse to learn from your experiences on the University of Florida campus, Florida community activism from the 60s to the present, and whatever reflections you may choose to share in the course of the interview. However, first, we'd like to gather some information from you about your background.
Okay.
These are things that will be important to people later on. First, could you state and spell your full name, please?
First name Daniel, D-A-N-I-E-L. Middle name Edward, E-D-W-A-R-D. And my last name is Harmeling, H-A-R-M-E-L-I-N-G.
Your date and place of birth.
November 6, 1941, in Sheboygan, in the state of Wisconsin.
Your mother's name.
Ruth, maiden name Kuskamp, K-O-S-K-A-M-P.
And her date of birth and place of birth?
Her date of birth would be May 17th, 1918, Oostburg, Wisconsin.
Well, you've really got some things to spell in there, Dave.
O-O-S-T-B-U-R-G.
Okay. And
Very
Sheboygan?
small Dutch community on the shores of Lake Michigan.
Okay, and Sheboygan?
Sheboygan, S-H-E-B-O-Y-G-A-N.
All right, there will be no quiz later.
Okay.
Your dad's name and
Carl, with a C, Carl Harmeling.
and date and place of birth.
And date of birth, April 12th, 1918. And he was also born in Oostburg, Wisconsin.
Okay. How about your parents' parents? What do you recall specific information of your grandparents on your mother or father's side?
Well, I knew both the grandfathers. Both grandmothers died either before I was born or when I was very young. So on my mother's side, her father was Dennis Kuskamp, and he remarried, and then so I just know his second wife is after he was widowed as Grandma Kuskamp. I know. And on my father's side, his father was Edward Harmeling, and he did a variety of things, including a dairy, Oostburg Dairy, as well as a carpenter and some other things.
And his wife, your grandma?
I really don't. I know I have documents like that. In fact, I have with me, I brought documents with me, my mother's personal history. She typed it out near the end of her life, and for 10 single-spaced pages, writes about her early childhood and the background of the family in Oostburg, Wisconsin. It's
What an
very
incredible
interesting.
gift and a blessing. I'm sure you reflect on it
And
often.
I can leave a copy with you. So
Well, and you're so generous with your documents and your information. I'm really looking forward to continuing the interview, but also just your spirit of giving and scholarship and being willing to allow us to conduct this interview. Do you have, I know you have a brother who has passed. Do you have other siblings, and could you talk about him a little bit? Okay.
I have an older sister, 3 years older than I am, who's now 70 years old and lives in Holland, Michigan.
And what is her name?
And her name is Mary. Her married name is Toppin. Mary Toppin Palma, dash Palma. Yeah.
And do you recall her date of birth?
Yeah, December 1st, 1938. And then I have a younger sister, and that would be Jane. And her last name is Goplin, G-O-P-L-E-N. And her date of birth would be July 14th, and it would be 1946.
Okay. And then you have your brother.
And then I have a younger brother.
Okay.
And a younger brother, his name is Carl John, and he's, let's see, he would now be, he would be 56. And he was born August 6th, 1952.
Okay. And then your deceased brother.
My deceased brother was Jim or James Dennis Harmeling. And it's hard to me to speak. Same date of birth. We were identical twins. I'm the eldest by 7 minutes. And he died January 22nd, 1967. I'll be composed, it takes a while, short while. And he died at the J. Hillis Miller Health Center, Shands, at the psychiatric ward. He was under psychiatric care. And for 2 months, 2.5 months, he was a patient there. November, December, and most of January. And at the end of his life, he was very distraught. He entered under severe depression. And he ended his life almost 2 days prior to his death when they found him unconscious and pumped his stomach. He was full of medication, his attempted suicide. And 2 days later, in the morning of Sunday, the 22nd of January, he had somebody in his room with him, 24-hour suicide nurse watch. What they didn't realize is that he had a gun in his room. And as he got up in the morning, from what I was told, he entered the bathroom, locked the door. And as the nurse asked, "Let me in, you can't do this," he shot himself in the head and survived maybe a couple of hours. That was it.
Your brother's experience with student government and campus activism
Yeah.
is a main part of why it was so important to ask you to be here and to share his reflections.
I first of all, I appreciate very much that not only who he was, but what he accomplished isn't forgotten as just, it's such a tragedy what happened to Jim Harmeling. Let's let that rest. Rather than that, I think his life, who he was, and everything about him is very proud part of our family and should be a proud part of the University of Florida. The tragedy was what happened. He had a very severe depression. There's no finger pointing that should go on, but it's certainly something that it was too bad it couldn't have been prevented, but things like that happen very tragically. Yeah.
Well, some say the level of campus activism from the 60s and the early 90s, that the tenure of that movement has changed. I want to know if you might reflect, as it comes to you, those times in the 1960s. Maybe you can begin with your brother's campaign for president of the student body at University of Florida in 1965.
Okay, well,
wherever you choose to start.
Actually, when he ran for president in 1965, the activism on campus began early in the summer of 1963. And it was inspired by the local movement in the civil rights movement within the black community and through the organization of the NAACP. The Youth Council was picketing segregated restaurants and the Florida Theater downtown Gainesville because of their segregation, no serving of black people and so on, and no admission to the movie theater.
Now, what were those restaurants?
And I have documentation on that.
Okay, of course.
We have flyers that can list all of that, and at some point we can include that. Maybe the next time I talk, I can hold that up for the camera. You can, but anyway, I've got all of that. The particular one we were interested in on campus was the College Inn, which is now right across the street on University Avenue from, I think it's Buckman Hall, and maybe now it's called the Purple Porpoise, but it was a big cafeteria-style restaurant at the time. And beginning in the fall of 1962, when the first undergraduate black students were admitted to the university at the freshman level, not graduate level and so on, these students, of course, were refused admission to the restaurant.
Even though it was called the College Inn.
It was called the College Inn, yeah. And what happened then, as the picketing began with the NAACP, a group was formed on campus called the Student Group for Equal Rights. And one of the first things that began, and it was one of our black students, Jesse Dean, was a part of the student group. Of course, he could not eat at the College Inn, and it was determined that a course of action would be to set up a picket, a very regular picket of maybe 5 to 10 people, and very orderly and so on, in front of the College Inn restaurant. And that began then during the summer. We did public relations, trying to get the student body to understand what we were doing. We put out a newsletter or a flyer called Common Sense, and has some very interesting stories in it. And copies of that are still around. I have a few of them. So that continued. And what we did is we built up some momentum. I would say that the people that were the most active in the organization may have represented about 15 to 20 students, with maybe a total of 40 in all who picketed. But 15 to 20 were always counted on as regulars. And from the very beginning, we had a faculty advisor, Marshall Jones, professor with a dual appointment at the medical school through the department, I think it was psychiatry, as well as through the Department of Psychology here at the university. And then a couple other names come to mind. One was Ed Richer, who was an associate or an instructor in the Liberal Arts College. And a couple of other names, I wouldn't know for sure what their titles were, but I remember the name Austin Creel, who was a professor in the religion department. So those were some faculty members. And so our activism not only was confined then to the College Inn, but there were maybe a half a dozen of us who became very active in the local NAACP, joined with the organization. And some of the names that come to mind are Charles Chestnut, who has been politically involved in this community. He was president of the Youth Council, the NAACP Youth Council, and Reverend T.A. Wright was president of the adult branch. So the adult branch was, I suppose, if you were beyond college, but the Youth Council was the activist group. And that was Charles Chestnut, as well as, of course, high school students. And some of the high school students, one name that comes to mind right away is Joel Buchanan. Joel was either a sophomore or junior in high school at the time, together with some others. So we would join with them in the picket lines too. And so many different things took place. One thing that happened was we started negotiating for the desegregation of the Florida Theater. Negotiating under what terms would they be willing to start admitting black people.
So you thought it was important to actually speak with the vendors and the business people to give them the opportunity to do the right thing first.
This was always, there was an attempt always at negotiating, right, rather than an in-your-face kind of thing. You know, how can we solve this problem? There was a biracial committee that had been set up in Gainesville, but that didn't seem to be getting anywhere. The only thing that seemed to work was when there was activism, a picket line, that seemed to spur negotiations. So that in that case, at the University, at the Florida Theater, what happened then was that there was a sort of a settlement that they would do this. One person or two black people would be allowed in on a Saturday afternoon. And then if there was no problem, maybe they'd try 3 people next time, but it would be in the afternoon. And if there was no problem, then maybe they'd try 1 or 2 people, black people, at night, and then to see. So it was going to be a gradual thing.
Was this integrated seating, or was this
well, as
separate?
it turned out, it seemed to be a bunch of nonsense. And so negotiations were broken. And so that theater, as I remember it now, unless it was done and we didn't even know about it, that desegregation really didn't take place unless it was just done on one or two people at a time, special people could get in. Until the passage of the public accommodations laws in 1964, the summer of 1964. And which brings to mind that there were people from our university students and faculty who also joined the 1964 protests in St. Augustine, joining Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference over in St. Augustine. And Marshall Jones was a part of that. My brother Jim and I were also part of that, but there were other names, Julian Brown, Dana Swan, these were all students at the university. A professor who's still around, David Chalmers, also was jailed for a while in St. Augustine as part of these protests. So anyway, once the public accommodations bill passed, then we set out in the Gainesville area to determine, are they going to really live up to this? So we decided to test this. And so we did. And we, for instance, would be going to, I particularly remember in particular one time, I had a date for the night, and a couple of black students had arranged also to join us. And so as we got ready to get close to the theater, we decided we weren't going to be a white couple and a black couple, we were going to be two interracial couples. So we switched dates. No problem at all. We enjoyed the movie and so on. So we had tested the Florida theater, not only just for black people, but for interracial couples. No one said a word or anything. We sat, enjoyed the movie, left, and so on. There was only one example, and it was probably briefly after the bill passed. We were very eager to see if our businesses were going to live up to the new requirements of the law. And a high school friend of Jim and mine from Winter Park High School, that's where we went to high school, Ron Barger. Ron wasn't active with us, but he basically believed in the same things. But he joined us. He, together with a group of I guess the other people were all black, as I remember it, went to a restaurant that we always thought was a safe one. But he went. Sure enough, the manager came up and said, well, I'm going to be serving 3 of you, but you're white. I don't have to serve you. He said that to Ron Barger. And Ron said, well, yes, the law requires that you serve me as well. He said, I'm not, and if you don't leave, I'm calling the police and I'm going to have you arrested.
What was the name of the restaurant?
I can't remember. But the newspapers had the articles during, this is, again, is something I would enjoy researching or have somebody do this.
I find it fascinating that you speak of the tactics of testing the compliance of the restaurants and testing negotiations. Did your group participate in workshops that taught you those techniques, or did you come up with them yourselves organically?
I think essentially we would often read about things that went on. We were very avid readers of different demonstrations that were occurring throughout the South. And of course, we had demonstrated in Tallahassee with Patricia Stevens Dew.
Yes, I was going to say, it reminds me so much of the core techniques of conservation
and,
quality.
and so we I can't recall now, but I know that Judy Brown and myself, certainly because of our friendship with Pat Dew, Patricia Stevens at the time, but then later on married John Dew, so then it was Patricia Stevens Dew, that we talked about nonviolent tactics and so on, things like that. So anyway, Ron was arrested by the police.
Really?
Arrested by the police, taken down, booked at the jail, city jail, downtown Winter Park. I mean, not Winter Park, Gainesville. So there Ron was in jail. Marshall Jones was called, got together the name of a lawyer, called, got him bonded out, bailed out, and within a week, the NAACP attorney had the Gainesville police drop charges.
Do you recall who the chief of police was at that time? Or the arresting
No,
officer?
I have articles on that, because at one time, maybe it was in the next year in 1960, probably beginning in 1965, when we formed our political organization called the Freedom Party. We also had a place just across the University Avenue, and we named that place Freedom Forum. And the police broke into Freedom Forum one night at 3 o'clock in the morning and took out boxes of literature, as we found out later on. The only mistake they made was, or if they didn't know it, somebody observed them at the all-night laundry across the street, came over next morning at 9 a.m. and let us know that the police were there. So a group went down, or a couple of representatives went down to the police station and said we certainly wanted to find out what it was that the police had a reason to break into Freedom Forum, who authorized this, and so on. And again, I have an article from the Gainesville Sun about that, and then the police chief apologized, said that was a mistake, and they brought everything back.
Allow me to break your continuity for just a second.
Oh, that's all right.
I've always been so impressed with your level of comfort with all types of people from all ranges of life. It's one of the things that I believe led to us, establishing a friendship and me knowing more about you. And I'm just curious, how did you feel as a white man being involved in these activities when you were very young, when there was, you were involved in biracial organizations and committees for equality and justice from the very beginning. But what was it? Was it difficult for you sometimes being in that situation, especially in Gainesville or in Tallahassee with Patricia Stephens Dew, and what was that like?
Well, I consider myself enormously fortunate that as a young child, I was raised in the Midwest. Wasn't raised in an atmosphere of racial prejudice at all. In fact, I would say that the opposite was true. My family, we weren't in a diverse community. Sheboygan, Wisconsin in the 40s did not have any black people living there. But one thing that, and I think probably I was about 8 years old at the time, there was a semi-professional baseball team. And two of the players on the team were black. These men could not ride the city buses in Sheboygan. And so when my father would see them walking, if we were just traveling somewhere, he would stop and pick them up and ask them, I'd like to give you a ride, where are you going? Nothing about, I hear that the buses weren't, but just, I'd like to give you a ride. It was, no one made waves then. These men just simply knew that they couldn't get on the bus because they would be, you can't do this.
Do you recall their names? Or the name of the
again,
team?
I don't. But anyway, my father would give them a ride. Jim and I were in the car. And as far as we're concerned, the thrill, not of knowing that these two men had been discriminated against, we didn't know that. Father didn't tell us that. But that we were riding in a car with professional baseball players. So what was my first experience with black people? Enormously positive. This, the kind of racism that occurs that you often hear white people say they were raised in a very racist atmosphere and so things like that. And then the other thing was there were two men who were a part of our church. It was called the Reformed Church of America. And these men were from Africa, and they were studying in the local seminary and studying to be missionaries. And times when they would attend the service on Sunday, my father would invite them to join us for Sunday dinner. So I can tell you that there were two categories of people in the world that were highest on the list. One was baseball players and the other were missionaries. And so this is my experience with black people.
And the people who were your support group or your mentors felt much the same. If I could move to Marshall Jones for just a second.
No, they had different experiences. Marshall said when he came here, he said he really hadn't interacted with the black community. And he writes about this in the book, I believe, but I know the story. He was a psychologist in Pensacola, connected with the Navy in Pensacola before he came to the University of Florida. And a student was assigned a science project from the black high school, Jesse Dean, one of the first of the 5 black undergraduates. Jesse, with his science project, came and talked to Marshall about, what he could do to help him with the science project. And it's through Jesse that Marshall learned about the NAACP, started getting active and doing some of the things with them, together with his wife, Beverly. And then when Marshall had an opportunity to come here, Jesse, I think he was a transfer. I think he had been in the community college there, transferred as a junior to the University of Florida. And I think he was one of the first, if not the first, undergraduates to receive a degree. Maybe Stephen Mickle was the first. But Jesse also went on to get, I think, a master's degree through the Department of Anthropology. And I don't know how often, again, I go off in these different directions, but I have to, before I forget, Jesse Dean, when the draft came and he got his draft notice, here's our first, one of the first undergraduate black students getting a master's degree, got his master's degree. He got his draft notice, he went to Canada, and Jesse Dean to this day still lives in Canada. Yeah, yeah. And for many, many years, of course, couldn't even come back until I think they passed amnesty when Jimmy Carter was president, so.
Are you still in contact?
I have talked with Jesse on the phone, yeah. But anyway, it's another interesting part of the University of Florida desegregation, that all these things took place. We were in the midst of not only the turmoil and change of the civil rights movement, also the anti-war movement, and then later on the women's movement. And the University of Florida students were intricately involved in all these activities. And I think that serves, in a way, you like to say, the university, by the way, has always been thought of as a leader in the South in the activism of the civil rights movement. And that's why this manuscript of Dr. Jones is called Berkeley of the South, because it was regarded that way. And there are people that have written about the student movements on the different campuses, the predominantly white campuses during the 60s. And the university was seen as the leading institution. So it's quite good that we have those thoughts. Now, I want to follow up on some things that you were asking, and I got drawn in another direction.
It's delightful just speaking with you.
Yeah.
And we're right on track. I would like to ask you about Marshall Jones, though.
Yeah.
The role that he played in your life and your development as the man you are today, as an activist, teaching you about leadership. What was he like, and what impact did he have on you?
Well, Marshall Jones was our faculty advisor. And I would say in the activist movement, he was a conservative influence. He did not necessarily like the idea that Judy and I had gone to Tallahassee and were arrested. When we came back, there was a thought, and this is something that actually took place, that we shouldn't be a part of the group anymore because we had acted on our own outside the auspices of the Student Group for Equal Rights, and that therefore we shouldn't be considered members. And Judy and I, returning from getting out of jail in Tallahassee, thought that quite the opposite. Our students here would be energized, and we'd in fact maybe even return to Tallahassee, join with the Florida A&M students, hundreds of them, almost 400 students who had been arrested, and show that the support of the University of Florida was with them. We came back and were told that we really shouldn't be members anymore, that Marshall and others of the executive. Now, Marshall wasn't the leader. I mean, there were students too. Marshall was one person. But, you brought up his name. And so Judy and I said, that is not the decision we're willing to accept. This is a small group of the people in the leadership positions that made this determination. And so we said, well, we need to bring this to a vote of the membership, general membership. So I still remember we met at the Hillel Center, and it was the next meeting in the general membership. By the time this meeting took place, it was very obvious. The general membership not only endorsed what we did, but wanted to encourage other people to indeed be activists, and voted each of us $300 of Student Group for Equal Rights treasury money to support us for our legal costs and other things that were going on.
So at the same time...
So that was, Marshall Jones was a conservative influence. I mean, he was definitely someone who made things possible. For instance, I will get to the point where I can tell you about how we formed a group called Committee for Student Recruitment. And we traveled the state to black high schools because the University of Florida was requested by us to go to these schools to seek out students. How were they even going to know that the University of Florida was desegregated?
Now, who was asking you to do this?
We came up with that ourselves. Oh no, we knew that if there were going to be more black students at the University of Florida, we were going to have to recruit them. Well, we knew, or that the university would. I knew of the Florida Blue Key Speakers Bureau. And again, have alligator articles about this. This was written up. We would always try to get publicity on our efforts. And we were told that the Florida Speakers Bureau, the Blue Key Speakers Bureau, would not be going to any of the black schools, either community colleges for transfer students or the high schools. So this was probably in the, I would say the early spring of 1964. Again, no, because it came up during the campaign of the Freedom Party. We were doing this then. So it might have been December, something like that, of 64, and then went on to 65. And so, yeah, and then in 65, probably in January, we started making our visits. So back to Marshall Jones, how would we poor students ever get around the state? Marshall always lent us one of his cars. So, I mean, he was a big help. He was an enormously wonderful person. But in terms of our activism, he grew just like all of us did. You asked about my comfort level, and I want to finish in that too, because it's interesting. I grew up free of this idea that you had this division between the races and that you had to be uncomfortable with black people because in fact you were white. When our family left the state of Wisconsin and came to Florida in probably 1950, of course it was absolutely segregated. But I can say we kind of grew up encased in a white middle class shell. We really didn't know much about life outside of that. We didn't know that the separation of the races was something that was by law. We thought it was just kind of a convenient arrangement that black people lived one place and one. So in a very naive kind of way. That experience, of course, was as you get older, you realize that wasn't the case. I remember in high school arguing on behalf of school integration, that the 1964 Brown decision said schools couldn't be segregated. So here I was in my all-white high school in 1958 or 59, having a debate on school integration. I always was promoting the idea that this should not be something that, in other words, black and white students should be attending school together and get to know each other.
Winter Park High School?
Winter Park High School. And I think our students who were black, or our young people who were black in Winter Park had to go all the way out to Eatonville to a school to attend. So they maybe had 20 miles, even though they probably lived within 2 blocks of Winter Park High School. An interesting story from high school. My brother and I were members of the Methodist Church and very active members of the MYF, or Methodist Youth Fellowship. And we were very fortunate to have a very progressive minister who was our leader of the church, and his wife, who was the person in charge of our youth fellowship. Unknown to the congregation, our minister was also a member of the NAACP and a member of the Florida Civil Rights Council. Quite an active role, I mean, quite. And this moral sense of racial justice was also part of our MYF. And so we would meet sometimes. I don't think the black youth of the Methodist Church came to our church, but we went to their church to meet with them. We also did that with youth from the synagogue. And I would never have remembered this, but 2 of my friends from high school reminded me when I met up with them 30, 40 years later. John Myers is one, and Maureen Doggett, the daughter of the minister, was the other. Said, "Dan, don't you remember what you did in high school when the Bethune-Cookman choral group came and they were in the church, and you put on some music, and we were listening to music, and all of a sudden you went over and asked one of the co-eds to dance, and you started dancing." I just didn't realize, I never thought about it. I thought that the best thing you could possibly do was, as young people, we had socials, we danced all the time, but the idea that interracial dancing was something that you could. And so both of them kind of reminded me, said, "Don't you remember doing that?" So it's sort of the perspective that I had might have been unusual, but it was definitely one that I had. My brother probably shared my same perspective, but he was probably a little more tentative, a little more maybe tune into not the segregationists, but the sensitivities of people who were against interracial activities, because he was a leader. He was the president of our student group. Actually, he was the president of the Student Group for Equal Rights here on campus, but he was also the president of our Methodist Youth Fellowship. And when they had an area organization of all the youth to join together in what they call Youth for Christ or something like that. Actually, he was the president of that, the first one in the Orlando area. So he was quite he'd step out front and was considered somebody with leadership skills and so on. I was somebody who was obviously a believer, but acting maybe more in terms of, well, I know it's right, I'm just going to go ahead and do this activity.
This moral component, was that something that a thread that ran through most of the people that were involved? We're doing what's right. God's work, treating people equally.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Sure. It was like, it's unfair. It's justice, racial justice or human justice. That civil rights was something that we felt compelled to be a part of the civil rights movement, because we felt not only was it freedom for Black people, but it was a freedom for us. So it was a struggle that we went in together. We realized that as they were segregated from whites, Black people, white people were segregated as well. We could be thought of as breaking the law if we did not adhere to the Jim Crow or the legal segregation that they had. So, and the other was just, as far as I can recall, the excitement that I felt was to be inspired by the courage of the young people and the elderly people in the Black community. I just thought it was wonderful that these people had the courage to stand up.
Are there any specific incidences that come to your mind?
Well, just the idea that I had never done anything like this before. I'd never carried a picket sign that said, equal rights for all or stop segregation. I never picked up a sign and walked publicly. I'd never taken a public stand. That I had argued, I did my activities within the Methodist Church, but now all of a sudden we were on the street. And I realized that these young people and their advisors, these were high school students, there were a few adults from the Black community that joined some of the public things, but they were very vulnerable in terms of their employment. They could easily get fired, and this was the case, throughout. Charles Chestnut was probably one of the fortunate ones, because the family had the Chestnut Funeral Home. No one was going to make trouble for Charles with his job because of his civil rights activities. And of course, Reverend Wright the same way. He was a minister of Mount Carmel Baptist Church.
But that was different for Dr. Jones, however.
But it was different for Dr. Jones. And Marshall ran into problems with the university as his appointment became one that was to be made permanent. He was going to be given, he had tenure already. He had all the academic credentials. He was publishing constantly. He was endorsed for tenure by his department, by the medical school, by every academic level, until you got to Dean Grinter and J. Wayne Wright's. Dean Grinter, the head of the graduate school of Grinter Hall.
J. Wayne Wright's Union.
And J. Wayne Wright's was the president of the university and then the dean of the graduate school. They turned it down. Said, look at Marshall Jones again. And again, I know of these because of Marshall's chapter in his book, Berkeley the Sound. And so they sent it back. They repeated it. Same thing. Unanimous endorsements. They sought some people out to see if they could somehow discredit Marshall Jones, and they couldn't find it. But they refused to do it. So then they took another tactic. They couldn't keep him from tenure with his academic credentials. Then they decided to say that he was an undue influence on students.
In what way?
That we wouldn't have somebody that, first of all, they actually wrote up against Marshall Jones. I know because at the time this happened to him. I was living in Washington, D.C. I was working there. I'd left school. I was married and had a child. They said that Marshall Jones had undue influence on students, including a particular family from Orlando, that Marshall had caused one student to marry a black woman.
He caused that?
He caused it, yeah. Influenced, unduly influenced, that was me.
So not
to
love.
marry a black woman. I was married, sure. In fact, you know, and a daughter to marry the campus radical. There was a student very active in the anti-war movement, and my younger sister Jane married Lucian Cross. And then, of course, they also said that he had influenced and somehow was related to the suicide of my brother. They actually wrote this up.
How did they justify that?
And the Florida Alligator actually editorialized. They couldn't find a way to almost, how do you express your disgust at a university would be doing something like this? And then they also did something else. They said he had written an article that was entitled The Role of Faculty in Student Rebellion. And what we had done on campus, of course, was to work for more rights to distribute literature on campus. The free speech movement was also a part of what we did here. How could you distribute your pamphlets if you didn't have a place on campus you were allowed to set up a table? So there was an ongoing struggle to be able to do this. And so they thought that Marshall, of course, had been a part of this and that they needed to get rid of him. And so in 1968, he was denied tenure, and he appealed it. As far as I know, the University Association, or there's some academic national group that actually censored the University of Florida for that, encouraging faculty to avoid positions at the University of Florida because of the circumstances of the firing of Marshall Jones. So Marshall Jones went on to take an appointment at University of Pennsylvania Medical School in Hershey, Pennsylvania, where even to this day he still has a emeritus standing and gets back there sometimes. So that was from 68 until, gosh, what is it, 2009? So yeah. So anyway, I'm not sure I stayed on task with my answers.
Oh no, I was reflecting because I think about, you know, just first of all, what a great place the University of Florida is to be.
Yeah.
And how there are all of these current efforts to reconstruct the past, to to make amends for harms of the past, to recognize some of these things in the past, and we're involved in a critical interpretation of these events. And I think about the names on the buildings. When you were talking about rights, you know, we have the Rights Union, that's the Student Center. We have Grinter Hall. I think
we have the O'Connell Center.
The O'Connell Center.
And what did Stephen J. O'Connell do?
Or Brown Hall. Yeah. What are your impressions that these persons in the past who were university figures that in some cases you interacted with, but in others you just know of incidents? What is it like that these people have been immortalized with their names on buildings, where other people who took significant acts of courage in response to social injustice have fallen between the cracks in history? That the gap is that people who some, including yourself, might recognize as heroes aren't recognized at all, whereas others, because of administrative advancement and maybe politics, depends on how you look at it, but those are the people who, if you didn't know anything, you just look and say, well, these are the great people, and maybe in their own ways they are great as well, but there's a dichotomy there. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think it's business as usual. I think people with political power, and I think people in academic positions at the University of Florida certainly have political power. I think political power will always lead to these kinds of recognition. It doesn't bother me. I just think it's ironic that sometimes people think of them as the people that paved the way for the successful desegregation or integration of the University of Florida. That somehow that was a smooth path. And in fact, when you think about what it took to get there, I think of all the students, African American students, who were the first to come to the University of Florida. were the first to desegregate Gainesville High School. These are the true heroes. We, in a way, were representing, making a point that this was something that ought to happen. I still remember some of us picketed the Alachua County School Board to promote the idea that they needed to be more on task to desegregate. And this was back, and I think maybe the following year they did that. But in terms of these buildings being named, I think the only thing that's missing is that I think the significant contributions in the civil rights movement that were made by students and faculty at the University of Florida, white and black, not just getting an academic degree, but what we did to fight the racial injustice, I think is something the University of Florida should be proud of. And I think they should have some official recognition of this. And I think maybe this project that I'm involved with, the two of you today, is part of that. As an example, for instance, what I worked at when I spent my career as a teacher, public high school teacher, middle school. And I finished my career teaching out in Levy County. That's when you said, you know, you're from Bronson, Florida. I taught at Bronson High School, but I became very active at the state level in the union too. And I found that this theater in Tallahassee, where I was arrested with these hundreds of Florida A&M students and Judy Brown, also from the university, was a Florida theater. Later on was no longer theater, but had been purchased by our state union, and was now an office building for us, our union headquarters, Florida Education Association, union headquarters in the Florida Theater. And when they had the grand opening of the building, I saw a nice booklet that commemorated this, and that said that the Florida Theater had a warm place in the history of Tallahassee. And it really bothered me. I said, I can't let this stand. There's all this history that's being forgotten. They never talked about the demonstration. So I proposed at the state level, that a plaque be put on the outside. Formal recognition about what had gone on in front of that building when it was a Florida Theater. And that a pictorial display of what went on in front, because there are plenty of pictures available. And it took me 2 or 3 years to do this. Pat Dew helped with that. But together with some of the Florida A&M students who were now, as I was, active in the union, we did this. And finally now at the big plaque, about like this, the story, very brief story of what that building represented. So there's a formal recognition of it. At the time we were arrested, in 1963, Ferris Bryant was the governor. And Ferris Bryant made the story all over the state. These students who are involved in these demonstrations who are being arrested are not the kind of people we want on campus, and they should no longer be students. They should be expelled. So he was doing that.
Now, Governor Bryant ran on more of a segregationist campaign.
Yeah, sure. That was back in the 60s. Now, take us back to I think it was the 90s. Governor Childs was the governor. Now we're recognizing this headquarters. There he is at the ceremony, congratulating everybody on the fine role that the Florida Education Association played, and that it was wonderful that they were recognizing this, so that plaque is out there. And now people know that took place, but without efforts at making sure people knew that history. And there were some people that knew the history, but just didn't realize that maybe something should be done about it. Other than that Florida Theater would just be gone in the past.
What obligation does the University of Florida, its students, administration, staff, our entire community in the current have to let these stories be known?
Well, I think it'll enrich everyone. I think it should make us feel good about ourselves and where we are today. That everything that takes place isn't just a smooth road. There were some rocks along the way. And it also is a way to recognize that even though people don't get buildings named after them and so on, they had a role to play in this change. And when you think about what we have in this country today, and I often think about this now, we have a former community organizer as President of the United States, President Obama. And when I look back, again, on some of the activities that the student group carried out, we were active in the community. I remember in particular a house burned in the black community that was being rented by a black family. And one of their children was trapped inside and burned to death in the building. And we went and realized, as we looked at that, in fact, I was living in the black community at the time, and this house was just adjacent to where I lived, that there were unsafe conditions, and that this house was being rented. It was owned by a white man who owned an insurance agency. We took pictures of it, showed the faulty wiring that probably caused that. We picketed the insurance company and then went to the city commission and complained about it and said that housing regulations weren't being enforced. There wasn't a housing code that was worth anything. So we were community organizers. So I'd like that recognition that this was the kind of thing that went on at the University of Florida. My brother, even though he ran as Freedom Party president, did not get elected. Bruce Culpepper was elected. Fred Lane was somebody else, finished second. He was elected a couple years later. Jim never got more than, 10, 11%. But at the end of the campaign, one thing in our platform was to be active in the community. And he stepped forward and said to the student government, at least carry on some of my platform, and they did. And that was the first time that the student government became active in a tutoring program in the minority community in Gainesville, the black community. And my brother was put in charge of that.
Now, Bruce Culpepper went on to become a very successful attorney in the state of Florida, and his son, Brad, was an NFL player and vice president of student body. So a lot of that carried on from that era.
Bruce Culpepper would remember my brother because they debated. Fred Lane, Bruce Culpepper, and Jim would be on stage, and here we were, Freedom Party. And by the way, we also got headlines in the Alligator because this was headlines, Negro students to be first running for political office. So there were all kinds of firsts that were. One thing that happened, when I told you about the student committee for student recruitment and how we went to black high schools, we went to Tampa. And when we were in Tampa, we met one student, not only who was the head of the student body, had the highest, almost perfect scores in the high school placement test, but weighed 240 pounds and was an all-state tackle on the football team at, I forget what the name of the high school was. His name was Medford Lee. And when I came back, I went up and I made an appointment to see Ray Graves, our football coach. And I said, Coach Graves, I said, there's a player down in Tampa. And this was in January by then. And I said, he'd be their first black player, but he's terrific. He's an outstanding student government president. And, he's the kind of person that would be an excellent football player. And Ray Graves said, well, he said, thank you for letting me know this. He said, right now we've already handed out all our scholarships. And I had no reason to disbelieve that. He said, but he could, if he enrolls, he can certainly come on as a walk-on. And so I said, I'm sure that we can get a lot of local churches to sponsor him until he gets his scholarship. Then Ray Graves looked at me and said, no, he said, I got to tell you, young man, he said, you can't do things like that. He said, you can't have athletes come with scholarships other than the university because the NCAA doesn't look kindly on that. And that was true. So, but anyway, then I also called the St. Petersburg Times, and the reporter actually wrote a little story about Medford Lee being this outstanding player. His goal was to play for the Gators. Wow. But he did get a scholarship. He did get a scholarship to the University of Louisville. And during his freshman year, was injured. And so, if you can imagine, if he had played in Florida and was injured, he'd have so he was able to continue, of course, his scholarship. And now he's an attorney, as far as I know, still practicing in Tampa, Medford. Wow. So that's, you know, there's so many connections that happen that I think these are, and again, all of this isn't just what I remember. These are things that when we piece it together are things that were documented in the newspapers and so on. I think it's a very rich history. And one I think the University of Florida should say, you know what? Just like all these other schools, you know, we know University of Alabama had George Wallace standing in the doorway. But there's something else George Wallace did. Later on, he apologized. And even though what he reacted to some of us in the way, because there were some certain things that happened, weren't at the magnitude of what George Wallace did. At the same time, he kicked me out of school. He kicked Judy Brown out of school. They dropped my brother, they kicked Jim, as soon as he finished running for student body president. He was in a master's program funded by the federal government in the Department of Psychology, working on a master's degree. They dropped him, said he didn't show enough interest. And he had to fight his way back in. And, you know, why did these things happen? Marshall Jones, these impeccable credentials. Why did it happen? The other thing is, it also is an important lesson to be told so that people know in the future, wait a minute, you may have controversial people. You may have people speaking out, but maybe they're just a little bit ahead of their time. Don't be so harsh. Give them a fair hearing. And maybe that's what a university community should be anyway. As a community of scholars, a community of thinkers, a community of ideas, so that this heritage of the student group for equal rights and what we represented and the individuals would be something that say, you know what, that's a proud tradition. Maybe that's something we could talk about. And maybe we'd have a little more activity at the student government so that the goal of student government often seems that anytime there's a campus event, everybody with a student government position gets to sit in the front. Everybody else comes an hour and a half early, and they're filling it, and there's all these reserved seats, and all of a sudden they come, they sit down. Do they have a more important role to play than that? We certainly did that with the Freedom Party. And by the way, it also is documented that after the Freedom Party did not win in '65, Samuel Taylor ran 3 or 4 years later and won the presidency of the campus. So that, again, initiated that. Where do you start? And when you think about it, that's what the Student Group for Equal Rights did. It started something. It also started, by the way, this double standard for women. We suggested that women should not have to be under a set of rules that were not applied to the male students, such as dress codes and so on. And that's in a platform we have. Did you ever see a copy of that Freedom Party? Oh, I'm going to leave these things with you. Okay. Oh, this is wonderful.
Well, I was just going to ask you to reflect on some of the most notable figures in the history of the different segments of your experience, or to reflect on some names or events. But
yeah,
because of your time commitment,
yeah.
What we'll do is we'll come back. I like to. Are we almost?
You're right.
Okay. What I was thinking is, I always like to close the interviews that I do, and people do it different ways.
Sure.
But to give you an opportunity to reflect back on something we talked about, something we didn't talk about, a high point for you, whatever it might be, and once you gather yourself and you're prepared to make that reflection, when you finish with your comments, that'll conclude the interview. So I want to thank you for taking the time to be here today, and for sharing your documents and your spirit of equality and encouragement and hope on so many things. And I look forward to talking to you again. And just want to leave it to you to close the interview out.
Okay. Well, Marna, it just feels good to be here. Once I get started, which means once I get over the initial emotional state, which brings me back to some of the hardest parts of my memories, it's so refreshing, invigorating for me to speak to these times. These were the best of times. They were, it's a kind of thing, every time I reflect on it, it's like, I can't imagine being the person I am today, and I feel good about the kinds of things I'm involved in now, without the stimulus of the civil rights movement that took place in the 60s. And really what it meant was, what it was like to connect with the Black community in such a way that I had the privilege to be inspired with people that were fighting for their rights. But I realized in joining with them, I was also fighting for my own rights. And it was exciting to be together. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Much appreciated.